This video is meant to address a persistent myth about Plato that you find online. What is that myth? Well, the myth is that Plato believed in innate knowledge. This myth, as I said, is very prevalent online. You will find plenty of people, plenty of sources saying that Plato did believe in innate knowledge. You'll even find some professors who have put materials online that say Plato believed in innate knowledge. But Plato did not believe in innate knowledge. It's a myth. Like most myths, it's based on something correct, which is that Plato certainly does believe that there is something innate in all human beings that is relevant to knowledge. What Plato believes in is innate, true beliefs. But it is, of course, a fairly famous commitment of Plato's that true belief does not equal knowledge. In fact, right after the most famous part of Plato's work in the Meno, where he announces his belief in something being innate true beliefs, right after that happens, and right after he makes an argument to the effect that there has to be something innate, after he lays out his theory of recollection, after there's the famous passage with the slave boy, immediately after that, he goes into talking about the difference between true belief and knowledge. And that's because, I think, in his own, kind of roundabout way, Plato wanted to make clear this wasn't innate knowledge he was talking about. You could call it innate knowledge if you're speaking loosely, but why speak loosely when you can speak, precisely? So, I'm going to go through in this video, hopefully real quick, why it is that Plato did not believe in innate knowledge, and why this isn't really something that you should treat as up for debate. Okay, so I believe that Plato does not believe, or did not believe, in innate knowledge. The first reason is that innate knowledge implies universal knowledge. Now, this is not strictly speaking true. It all depends on how you explain why people have innate knowledge. Now, a related common misconception about Plato, related to the common misconception that he believed in innate knowledge, is that Plato thought people got that knowledge from their previous lives. Right? So Plato, in a couple dialogues, shows that he, or says anyway, that he believes in reincarnation. He believes that the human soul is immortal. He's quite clear on that one. But he also believes that the way this immortality works is that human beings, when they die, their soul survives. Their body dies, their soul survives. And the soul eventually, not right away, but eventually goes into another living body. And which body you go into is determined by, how well you lived in life, things like that. It's fairly common belief, not among the Greeks, but among lots of different people over the course of the world, right? So that's Plato's belief in reincarnation. Now, what a lot of people do is they say, oh, okay, Plato believes in reincarnation. He brings up that belief when trying to explain innate knowledge. So it must be that our innate knowledge comes from our previous lives. Now, if our previous lives were the source of our innate knowledge, then it would be the case that we could potentially be born with different sets of innate knowledge. So if in a previous life I was a pilot, I might be born with innate knowledge of how to fly a plane. Whereas if you were a sailor, you might be born with the innate knowledge of how to sail a boat. And we wouldn't have the same innate knowledge. So there wouldn't be knowledge that's universal. But it is just not the case that Plato believes that you get your innate knowledge from your previous lives. How do you know that? Well, the belief in reincarnation gets expressed in the Mino in response to Meno's paradox. What's Meno's paradox? Meno's paradox is the paradox found in the dialogue, the Meno. It is called Meno's paradox because that's the name of the dialogue it appears in. Meno, the character, only ever contributes one part of it. The relevant passage is here. Meno says, "How will you look for it, Socrates, when you do not know at all what it is? How will you aim to search for something you do not know at all? If you should meet with it, how will you know that this is the thing that you did not know?" Socrates responds, "I know what you want to say, Meno. Do you realize what a debater's argument you are bringing up? That a man cannot search either for what he knows or for what he does not know. He cannot search for what he knows, since he knows it, there is no need to search, nor for what he does not know, for he does not know what to look for." In those lines, Meno's paradox is announced. Here is Meno's paradox written out. We have premise 1, we cannot search for what we know, for we already know it. Premise 2, we cannot search for what we do not know, for we do not know what to look for. Premise 3, for every x, we know it or we do not know it. This leads to the conclusion. We can search for nothing. Now, the better way to put this, the traditional way to put it, is to say we can inquire about nothing. The search here is a search for knowledge, or inquiry. The reason this is a paradox is because the word paradox in Greek means para, beyond, and dox for doxoi, or beyond belief. Doxoi is belief. It has a conclusion that is beyond belief. And what Plato's going to have Socrates do in the rest of the dialogue is respond to this paradox. And the way he's going to respond shows you what his beliefs about knowledge are. But this is the context in which Plato brings up reincarnation. He brings up reincarnation in order to explain how to get out of this problem. Now, the way reincarnation helps is a little bit complicated. And that's, I think, what leads to this myth. Because here's, I think, the way most people think about this. Reincarnation shows that we already know the things, right, that we might be thinking to search for. And so that technically we don't search for it. Right? Premise 1 says we cannot search for what we know, for we already know it. And if you believe that reincarnation leads to innate knowledge, then we already know things. We don't search for them after all. It turns out the conclusion of Meno's paradox is correct. Except for it's very clear in the text, Socrates does not think the conclusion is correct. He says explicitly we should not believe it. So this is not the right way to interpret Plato's response. Suppose, for the sake of argument, though, that it was the right way. Suppose you thought Plato actually accepts Meno's paradox, accepts the conclusion anyway. Then apply that to this solution, or what people incorrectly take to be a solution, which is that because we have previous lives, we're born knowing things we learned in those previous lives. The problem is, if Plato accepts the conclusion of Meno's paradox, we can't search for anything, we can't inquire after anything, we can't gain knowledge at all. Then that means we didn't gain knowledge in our previous lives, because gaining knowledge is impossible. And if we didn't gain knowledge in those previous lives, then where did the knowledge we had in those previous lives that's supposed to carry over to our current life, where did that knowledge come from? We might say, oh, it came from a life before that one, right? So now we're looking 2 lives back. But then the question just arises again. If inquiry is impossible, if gaining new knowledge is impossible, then how did we get it 2 lives ago? Well, it goes back again. As you can see, this is going to generate a regress. It's going to generate basically an insoluble problem. If your interpretation of Plato's response to Meno's paradox is that the conclusion is correct, then that's going to undermine any attempt to say that we get innate knowledge from our previous lives. And that's not what Plato thinks. Plato does not think we get knowledge from our previous lives. He actually thinks, and this becomes more clear in different dialogues, he thinks we get our knowledge not from our previous lives, but from the time when our soul is not in a body at all. So I said before that eventually your soul ends up in another body, according to Plato. But it doesn't happen right away. For a while, your soul is just sort of free and unencumbered by any body, because Plato does believe a body is an encumbrance. At least cognitively, it's an encumbrance. And that's going to be the solution. Right? That's where the information gets into us, not through inquiry, not through having experiences which lead to the development of knowledge that then carries over into our next life. Our souls become in touch with all the facts in sort of this intellectual, spiritual realm. I'm right on the verge of endorsing another myth about Plato, but it's a simple way to talk about it, so I'm going to keep talking about it for now, the way I am. But that's where you get it. And since our knowledge does not depend on any particular experiences we had in previous lives, it depends only on the time our souls spent outside of anybody whatsoever. When we're being exposed to all the fundamental truths of the world, all equally, that means the correct solution to Meno's paradox does not imply that we will have different knowledge at birth, different innate knowledge. We'll all have the same innate knowledge. And so, innate knowledge, on the way Plato understands where it comes from, implies universal knowledge. So if Plato believed in innate knowledge, then he'd have to believe in universal knowledge. Does Plato believe in universal knowledge? No, absolutely not. There's nothing more clear in Plato's work than that he does not believe that everyone knows things. To see that, let's go to probably the most famous dialogue of Plato's, the Apology. In the Apology, Socrates, while defending himself against charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, gives an explanation for the behavior that he believes got him into the trouble he's in. And that behavior was going around looking for people who had knowledge. The story is that once upon a time, a friend of his went to the oracle at Delphi. The oracle at Delphi said that Socrates was the wisest man alive. Socrates didn't believe the oracle, didn't understand why the oracle said that, because Socrates believed he had no knowledge. So he went around trying to disprove the oracle. He went to the politicians, and then he went to the poets, and then he went to the craftsmen. And he found that each one of them lacked knowledge. The politicians lacked any knowledge whatsoever. The poets lacked knowledge because they couldn't explain why the true things they said were true. So there's a distinction between the poets and the politicians. The poets say many fine and just things, but they can't describe to you or explain to you why they're true. Socrates says they were just inspired, as though by a god, to say them. But they don't understand why the true things they say are true. And then the craftsmen do have genuine knowledge, but it's just not of things that are worthwhile. They know how to do things, but they don't understand any fundamental or deep truths about morality, right? About how the world works or things like that. And so he concludes that his special wisdom, the wisdom that the oracle at Delphi attributed to him, is only that he has enough wisdom to know that he has no wisdom worth knowing. Or, as it's often expressed, he knows that he knows nothing. But the thing is, that makes him better than everyone else. The point of this story is that Socrates is wiser than all other people because he knows that he knows nothing worthwhile. And nobody else does. They all think they know things, but don't. And as you see here, I think they here are the young men who follow Socrates around to watch him interrogating the politicians, the poets, and the craftsmen. I think they find an abundance of men who believe they have some knowledge, but know little or nothing. This is a point Plato has Socrates make again and again, that many people who think they know things know nothing. And that, as far as Socrates can tell, no one has any of the kind of knowledge that he, Socrates, seeks. So far from there being universal knowledge, there's almost universal ignorance. So any theory that said there would be universal knowledge could not be a theory that Plato accepts. And so any theory that says that we have innate knowledge would imply universal knowledge. Plato clearly doesn't think we have universal knowledge, so Plato doesn't think we have innate knowledge. the explanation he gives for the way that reincarnation and the soul's immortality plays a role in responding to Meno's paradox shows that we're not getting our knowledge from previous lives. So we're not going to have different sets of innate whatever. I mean, a lot of people say innate knowledge, but like I'm trying to tell you, Plato doesn't believe in innate knowledge. But whatever it is that's innate is going to be the same for each of us. And so if it were knowledge, it would be universal knowledge. Plato clearly doesn't think there's universal knowledge, so Plato does not believe there's innate knowledge. This is very, very clear in the text. If you need more textual proof of this, go back to the Meno, the dialogue where he announces his belief in reincarnation and then the theory of recollection and the belief that there's some kind of innate something. I'll say a little bit later in the video what that is. There's the famous passage where he interrogates the slave boy. Meno has a slave boy with him, a servant of some kind. And the servant speaks Greek, so Socrates is able to talk to him. Socrates establishes that the boy has not been taught mathematics, and then he starts asking him mathematical questions. This exchange with the slave boy is supposed to provide evidence for Plato's view. And so, if Socrates believed in, or if Plato believed in innate knowledge, then he would have Socrates, while interrogating the slave boy, make clear that the slave boy knew the correct answer all along. But what we actually see here, if you look at the text, is you realize, Meno, what point he has reached in his recollection. At first, he did not know what the basic line of the 8-foot square was. That's the math problem he's asking about. Even now, he does not yet know. But then he thought he knew and answered confidently, as if he did know. And he did not think himself at a loss. But now he does think himself at a loss. And as he does not know, neither does he think he knows. It's made very clear. The slave boy does not know the answer to the question at the beginning of the interrogation. It's only when they go through the process that he ends up with knowledge at the end. If Plato believed in innate knowledge, then what he would say is, the boy knows the answer to the question, but is for some reason unable to answer the question correctly. The boy knows, believes he knows, but gives incorrect answers and believes that the incorrect answers are the correct answers. You could give an explanation of that. You could maybe come up with some theory according to which that's what would happen. But it's just very clear it's not the theory Plato is offering in this dialogue. The slave boy does not know the answer to the math question at the beginning of the process. He does know it at the end of the process. This is supposed to be a model for how all inquiry works, because Plato's response to Meno's paradox is not to accept the conclusion. Plato's response is going to be to deny premise 2. The whole case of the slave boy is going to be a case, or an example, of someone who starts out not knowing the answer to the question, Plato makes that explicit, and ends up knowing the answer to the question. So it's supposed to be a case where 2 is shown to be false. The role of innateness is not going to be in saying that the slave boy had innate knowledge the whole time. It's not going to show that what's going on in the slave boy example is the slave boy already knows things, and so the inquiry is pointless. The whole idea is that what Socrates says to the slave boy, and the slave boy's responses in turn, are vital to what's going on, vital to the slave boy ending up knowing. And it's going to be innate true beliefs that the slave boy has that explains how he's able to go from not knowing to knowing. And it is the innate true beliefs that are what is recollected. Not knowledge, but innate true belief. All right, going back to the end of the slave boy example, Socrates, what do you think, Mino? Has he, in his answers, expressed any opinion that was not his own? No, they were all his own, Mino says. And yet, as we said a short time ago, he did not know. There again, more textual evidence that the slave boy at the beginning of the interrogation does not know the answer to the question. Mino responds, that is true. Socrates, so these opinions were in him, were they not? Yes, says Mino. So, and here's sort of the general lesson, the man who does not know has within himself true opinions about the things he does not know. so it appears. What the true opinions do, the role of true opinions in inquiry, is that the Socratic method, which is really what the Meno is written to defend. The Socratic method works by having people give answers to questions and having the questioner, played by the role of Socrates in the dialogues, ask questions that are designed to show or designed to get the person to realize that their answers are incorrect. But how do they know they're incorrect? If they don't already know what the answer to the question is, how can they be made to be aware that the answers they give are incorrect? Well, what Plato thinks is all of them have true opinions about the issue they're being asked about. They don't yet have knowledge precisely because they're not able to do things like give definitions to key concepts. Most of the dialogues concern attempts to give definitions of things like justice or piety or friendship or bravery, things like that. And at the beginning, no one really knows what the definitions of these things are. And as a result, they're not able to explain why the answers they give to questions are incorrect, or correct rather. And it is precisely that ability to explain that is key to knowledge, according to Plato. Remember that in the Apology, there were 3 failed cases of knowledge, or 3 failed cases of knowledge that counts as wisdom. In the case of the politicians, they say false things, right? They're answers to questions you give them about the fine and the good. These are the things that are worth knowing about, according to Socrates and Plato. The answers they give are just false, so the question of whether or not they know things doesn't arise. In the case of the craftsmen, the answers they give are true, and to some extent they're able to explain them. It's just they don't have wisdom because the things they know about aren't the fine and good things. The craftsmen know how to make stuff, but they can't tell you what true friendship is. They can't tell you what bravery is. They can't tell you what justice is. They can't define these things for you. And as a result, they don't have knowledge about those fine and good things. The closest you get is the poets, but the poets still fail, not because their opinions aren't true. Right? Socrates believes that the poets say true things about weighty and important matters. They lack knowledge because they can't explain why what they say is true. And the reason they can't explain it is that they can't even give precise definitions of the terms they're using. And so knowledge is going to concern the ability to explain why your true beliefs or true opinions are true by reference to general definitions of the terms you're expressing your knowledge with or expressing your true opinion with. And this is exactly what happens in the slave boy example. The slave boy can recognize when he's gone wrong because he has true opinions about geometry. He lacks knowledge about geometry because he can't define the relevant geometrical terms and ideas. Right? If you'd asked him to define a square or a triangle, he would have struggled. And in fact, at the end, Socrates says he still has a long way to go, but if he keeps going along this process of recollecting, of forcing himself to examine the answers he gives to questions and examine them seriously and critically so that he's able to recognize when he goes right and when he goes wrong, then eventually he'll have knowledge. He has knowledge about the particular question, about the diagonal of the square, but he doesn't have sort of general geometrical knowledge at the end. He can go on to acquire that. The function that true opinion plays is that it allows you to determine when the definitions you've suggested, right, the provisional definitions of key terms and concepts that you have accepted, have implications that are false. You can recognize what's true and what's false without knowing the relevant definitions, right? You can recognize when your definition of a square or a diagonal or a triangle have implications that are untrue without being able to define any of those key concepts yet. and as a result, being unable to explain why, when you do get the correct answer, the answer is correct. So what Plato believes in is innate true opinion, not innate knowledge. The only way to go from true opinion to knowledge is to go through the Socratic method, or dialectic, in order to get to the point where you can explain why the answers you give to questions that are true, and explain that by reference to general definitions of terms. You do not have knowledge of definitions right from the beginning. What you have is true opinions about the things defined. So, Plato does not believe in innate knowledge. The text makes this very clear. What's not quite as clear is the role that true opinion, which is what Plato does think you have innately, you're born with true opinions about things. What's not clear is the role that plays in getting you to knowledge. But the way that Plato responds to Meno's paradox is to deny premise 2. He believes that we can search for what we do not know because we have true opinions, which are not yet knowledge. And that's what happens in the rest of the dialogue, or a big section of the rest of the dialogue, after the interrogation of the slave boy. Meno asks, well, why isn't true opinion enough? Why can't we just rest easy with what we are born with? And Socrates gives certain explanations. That part of the dialogue is, I think, a lot less clear than it otherwise, than other parts of the dialogue are. I wouldn't be comfortable declaring that certain popular views about why knowledge is valuable, or why Plato thinks knowledge is valuable. There's certain popular views out there that I believe are incorrect. I wouldn't be comfortable just declaring those views that I think are incorrect myths. But what is a myth is that Plato believes in innate knowledge. He does not.